exactly what shape that will take. That's presuming we ever did know. So the question we're asking on Talkback, is a general election the solution to this problem? Will a general election solve Brexit? 03030 80 55 55. You can text us 81771. And look, if you've never called William on the programme, I've never sat in for William on the programme, so you be nice to me, I'll be nice to you. We'll have a merry old time. But we would like to hear from you. Is a general election the way we're going to get out of this? Speaking in the comments, as I said, Geoffrey Cox, he's taking questions from all over the place, but there was a noisy reaction to begin with when he gave his first reaction to the judgment.
The government accepts the judgment and accepts that it lost the case. And at all times, the government acted in good faith and in the belief that its approach was both lawful and constitutional.
The Prime Minister is due to talk. There's no PMQs today, but he is going to take some questions in a little while. We don't exactly know when, but we will bring you, if we're still on air when it happens, we'll cross to the House of Commons live. But first, let's talk about all of this. Writer, broadcaster, columnist Brian Feeney is sitting opposite me, as is the former DUP MLA and unionist analyst Nelson McCausland. Afternoon, gentlemen. To you, Felicity Huston and Rick Wilford are also going to be giving us their input in a little while. Brian Feeney, though, that's the question we're asking. Will an election solve this Brexit pickle?
I don't think so. There will be an election because Boris Johnson has no majority for anything, and he has always wanted to have an election to get a majority. But it depends when it happens, and it looks like it's going to be November because they won't allow him to have an election before the 31st of October. The problem is if he has an election and he hasn't left the EU, do or die, his opponents are going to say to him, this was your main objective and you failed in it. And the Brexit party will do quite well in the election. So you may end up with a four-way split: Conservative, Labour, Lib Dems and Brexit, and another hung parliament. There is no guarantee that he will get a workable majority.
They have already said, I think he said in the last 24 hours or so when he was in America, Boris Johnson ruled out doing a non-aggression pact with Brexit, but some would argue that he would have difficulty taking them on head to head. So
yeah,
is that bluster?
He won't do a deal with Brexit. His aim has always been to destroy Nigel Farage, UKIP, Brexit, and get them out of the way and make the Conservative Party the dominant party for Brexit. I mean, his whole campaign when he was going for the leadership of the Conservative Party was really to move to the right and say he was going to be the man who could get Britain out of the EU and simply wipe out the Brexit Party. Now, if he doesn't do that by the 31st of October, then he's going to be facing them, and he won't have a pact with them, but they could do tremendous damage to the Conservative Party.
Nelson McCausland, we've been saying for months now that there's paralysis in Westminster. There's a theory, just throw all the cards up, see how they land. We couldn't possibly be worse off.
Well, I think the people of the United Kingdom deserve a general election. And secondly, I think the situation in Parliament demands it. Because this is a paralysed Parliament. Some have described it as a rogue Parliament. You have a Remainer Parliament, certainly. The majority of MPs are Remainers, whereas the majority in the referendum voted to leave the EU. Will it solve things? Will it give a resolution? Will there be a decisive outcome? Who can tell? Particularly if you are in that situation that Brian was speaking about there of a four-way split. Anything could happen. How does it break down on both sides of the divide? In some ways, you get a situation not dissimilar to Northern Ireland, where you have splits within nationalism and split within unionism.
But doesn't that touch on the point? If the people are going to go back to the polls, people will have to really consider how they're going to vote. They will have to almost vote differently if they want to avoid the mathematics we have in the Commons at the minute. It's a question for all of us and where we put our take.
Yes, and it's very hard to predict how that will work out. I can't imagine.
Would you change your vote because of what's happening?
I think here in Northern Ireland, the matter is somewhat different from across the world.
There are a list of options on the page.
There are a list of options, but I would be quite content in the way that I have voted in the past and probably will continue to do so. So I'm not sure that it will produce a particularly decisive outcome, but there has to be some change in the situation. You just cannot go on forever with the current impractical predicament that Parliament's in.
And yet you wouldn't consider your own vote. That's just interesting. If you're reflective of other people, say, look, and we know your political past, but I mean, you wouldn't even consider shaking up the numbers inside if it's to give us movement.
Well, one of the interesting things about an election would be that if you had a similar outcome of a hung Parliament, and people are suggesting that may well be the sort of outcome you have, the votes of the Northern Ireland MPs in that situation would retain significance in a way that they've had in the past, in the first few years.
Well, we don't
know. We don't know. No, we don't.
I mean, if everyone voted the same way round,
that's why I said it's possible. I'm not saying it's probable, I'm not saying it's inevitable, I'm just saying it's a possibility that needs to be kept in mind.
Everyone won't vote the same way. The big difference was the arrival of the Brexit Party on the scene and the huge success they had in the European elections in May, because a lot of people were so fed up. A lot of the leavers were saying, listen, it's been 3 years, we haven't left, and what's gone on, and the Conservative Party hasn't delivered, and we don't like Theresa May's deal. And the Brexit Party did extremely well. And this is the problem that Johnson's going to have to face if he goes for an election in November, and he hasn't left. And at the moment, it doesn't look as if he's going to be able to. Parliament will not allow him to get round asking for an extension. And if he doesn't ask for an extension, there will be a court case. And according to Lord Sumption this morning, the court will appoint an official, possibly the Cabinet Secretary, to sign a letter carrying out the act.
We'd like your thoughts on this. 030 30 80 55 55. We're all familiar with the debates. We're just wondering whether you think an election will move this situation on. We heard what Brian said there about the options facing Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister. Felicity Huston is a member of the Northern Ireland Conservative Party. What do you think, Felicity? I mean, you couldn't possibly feel buoyant heading into an election. Surely you'd be crossing your fingers and toes.
Well, I think we just have to have an election. The boiling fury in the country outside the M25 is I think, palpable. And I think the only outlet for it is an election, because otherwise, as many commentators have said, and people from all sides of political views, that things could get very, very nasty.
Felicity, I'm going to come back to you in a second. Let's cross to the Commons. Steve Baker, one of those staunch Brexiteers, is on his feet in the Commons. Let's see what he's saying.
She shouts shocking. It's Lord Sumption who said it. Yes. Isn't it the case that prior to this revolutionary decision by the Supreme Court, it's quite likely, indeed probable, that his advice was entirely correct until the Supreme Court changed the law?
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for the question. I can't disclose what advice I gave. The honourable lady who first asked this question had that answer, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to keep giving it today. But what I would say is that the Supreme Court did indeed, as it overtly and explicitly said, develop the law. It took what was a political convention, hitherto in all of the constitutional textbooks described as unenforceable by a court, and decided that it would set a test and convert it into a legal principle and a legal test. And that it was perfectly entitled to do, just as this House will in the coming months and years have to reflect upon the implications of it and whether it is content to leave that position untouched. But for the moment, it is the law, and the law must be obeyed.
Stephen Doughty. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Attorney General be very, very clear?
That was Geoffrey Cox, the Attorney General. He's the one fielding questions at the moment. The debate is about the legal advice that he gave to the government as their top lawyer in proroguing Parliament. He said he doesn't feel he has to resign, and he's not sure yet whether he will reveal exactly the details of that legal advice. But the question we're asking And I should say we will keep dipping in and out to the Commons once we see the people getting to their feet, people who we think we should hear from. But the question we're asking, will an election solve this Brexit deadlock? We were talking to Felicity Huston. You were rudely interrupted, Felicity, but I appreciate your...
Steve, I don't mind him interrupting me.
You said that we need an election, but the point is that all the political parties are agreed on that we need an election. The question is, will it solve anything?
Well, it would at least give people an opportunity in a rational and peaceful way to express their views on how they think the country has been run recently and since the referendum. And I think, that's partly what an election is about. We live in a democracy where people get the opportunity to express their views through the ballot box. And that's what I think it is doing. Now, Lord only knows what those views will produce. But I think it is vital that the population has the opportunity to express its views. And that's how we, in a Western democracy, do it. The alternative is very nasty, and I don't think any of us want to see how the population might otherwise express its views.
Are you being optimistic, thinking that people will have the performance of politicians in their mind when they're voting, and not, as many people have suggested, they'll be voting on Brexit lines? This is a pseudo-second referendum, that's all.
But it's also an opportunity for people to rethink. Do I agree with what I voted X number of years ago? Yes, I do. And it will also be for people who have found themselves with an MP who has not, in their opinion, represented their views. They can take a view on whether they'd like them to continue on or not. And I mean, that is what happens in elections, and they're fought on all sorts of things, but there can often be very key points. And it's no doubt that, because of what has gone on in the past 3+ years, that's all we think about, and that's how people will vote. Yes, absolutely.
Because of the Fixed Term Parliament Act, it can get a little bit... there are rules and regulations as to how we get to an election, and we'll talk to Rick Wilford about that in just a second. Let's go to your calls, though. 03030 80 55 55. Afternoon, Brian.
Hello, certainly. Yes, answer to your question, there should be another general election because it is going to be all around Brexit. People are going to vote for the candidates who are want to leave and stay and so forth. But a question to the panel, what's the possibilities are of getting on the ballot box that either stay or leave? Because people this last few years are more educated on the pros and cons of Brexit.
Wouldn't that just be a referendum though, Brian?
Well, the election is going to be a form of a referendum as well, because people are going to vote for the candidates who they want, as in stay and leave and so forth. So I'm just asking the question, would that be practical in getting a separate question on the ballot box, on a ballot paper?
Would you change the way you voted because of Brexit alone?
No, I voted to remain because,
But in a general election, would that alter how you vote?
Oh, I would vote for the candidate who wants to remain. That's who I would vote for.
But is that the candidate you always vote for?
But people I know have changed their mind because of what this last few years, and we all know what's happened, the lies on both sides. The lies that we're told.
I was sorry, Brian, the line broke up there. I was wondering, are you going to change the person that you normally vote for based on Brexit?
Yes. If it comes to that, yes.
All right.
I'm not going to vote for a candidate who wants to leave. I'm voting for the candidate who wants to remain.
Nelson McCall, this is going to be when the election happens, and we're all pretty certain it's going to happen, probably before Christmas. This is going to be a second pseudo-referendum.
In a sense.
Well, it'd be a first pseudo-referendum. Well, it'd be a second shot at the referendum that happened more than once before. Anyway, you know what I mean?
I think the key point for me was what Felicity Huston said about the world outside the M25. There is a division within the United Kingdom now between a heavily London-centric view of the world, one that is expressed overwhelmingly in Parliament by the Remainers, and many people outside who are saying, we voted in a referendum, we were told it would be implemented, we won the referendum, and ever since we've had 3 years of frustration, obstinacy, obfuscation, everything that can be done to prevent it actually happening. I noticed one of the Conservative MPs standing outside Westminster the other day being interviewed and saying the people voted, and then pointing at Westminster he said, but the people in there said no. And that positioning of the Conservative Party and Boris Johnson in terms of people, not versus Parliament, but then against the politicians who've been in Parliament. I think that will strike a chord with many people.
I don't think the MPs...
This is Wilfred, hello.
Hi.
Sorry, I hadn't quite gotten round to... I was just about to welcome you to the conversation, Rick. Away you go.
Okay, I'm going to disagree with Nelson, because I don't think the Tory MP was right by pointing to the House of Commons. The people in there said no. The people in there said yes, but... And the but is actually what matters here, which is securing an agreement that is sufficient to carry a majority in the House of Commons. This wasn't. This narrative of framing the people versus Parliament, which so many, certainly in the Tory party, and I suspect there are some in the DUP, who cleave to that view, it's just nonsense. Parliament is composed, as you said earlier, of a majority of Remain MPs, but they have stuck to the task of trying to secure an agreement that's capable of securing a majority in the House of Commons. So they did it with reluctance. That's why I say it was yes, but, rather than a flat no. And that's what's been happening, and that's what will continue to happen. I want to agree with something Brian said earlier too, which was that if by hook or by crook, Johnson is constrained to sign the letter asking for an extension, the Brexit Party is going to mount an enormous campaign, both social media as well as on the doorsteps, and he is going to be, as it were, buffeted by the Faragists, who will probably do rather well in this election, and we could end up with a Parliament that is split in even more ways than it already is, and that is going to make the task of securing an agreement even more difficult.
Despite what he said in the last 24 hours about not making any pact, I mean, does Boris Johnson have any option but to work with Nigel Farage and try and get him to do a non-aggression pact?
Well, he's flatly dismissed the possibility of any kind of arrangement with Farage and his party. I think that would be a complete admission of defeat if that was to be the case.
He has to defeat the Brexit Party.
Got to, in order for the Conservative Party to survive.
Yeah. I mean, it is about the Conservative Party, and it's about the survival of the Conservative Party as a party of government. And if he tries to make a deal with the Brexit Party, that'll be the end of the Conservative Party as a party of government.
Felicity Huston, how do you beat the Brexit Party without working with them?
Oh, I don't think he can. I mean, because I know a lot of people involved with the Brexit Party over in England and so on, and even here. And, I think they have a very clear message. And I don't think he can. I mean, if he can't get us out by the 31st of October, he's going to have to do a pact with them in some way or other. I don't know what it'll be called or what it'll come up with, but I fail to see how. Otherwise, the Tories will be there, but they will not be a large, as big a party as otherwise. And probably we will have some sort of coalition between Brexit and the Conservative Party. I imagine running the country. Who knows? I mean, we can all, pull out all sorts of ideas, but, every two or 3 days we rip up the rule book and start again.
Deputy Prime Minister Nigel Farage, is that what we're looking at?
Yes.
Let's go to Londonderry. John's on the line, 030 30 80 55 55. Welcome, John.
Hello, Desmond. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. What's your take on this?
Listen, I'm just there. If in the event that Boris decides to write to the EC for an extension, right? And he asks for a 2-day extension, the EU will say no.
He can't. The law requires him. He can't. The law requires him to ask for a specific period of extension. 3 months.
I never heard that before.
Yes, it'll take us through to the end of January.
No one has ever mentioned that before.
Is that your big plan shot in the foot, John?
Well, it's not a plan. It's just an observation.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate it. But do you think what the main question was, do you think an election will solve Brexit? Because by talking about pushing it 2 days or 1 day, that sounds like you're leaning towards jiggery-pokery and let's try and squeeze this through and nudge a bit here and nudge a bit there. You wouldn't just...
It's a wee bit like most political parties. Well, an election would
said that, not me.
Be a good idea.
Okay.
An election would be a good idea. Get it out in the open for once and for all.
Thanks, John. Pat is in Ballygassoon. Afternoon.
Good afternoon, Declan. Welcome to Hot Seat.
Oh, I appreciate it. It's feeling pretty hot at the minute, I can tell you. What's your take on this, Pat?
the topic on the discussion here seems to be the general election, and there's no alternative. Could I suggest to you, and it's been about for a long time,
please do,
the idea of the people's vote, as a referendum, as a confirmatory, consultation of the whole population, is and has always been the alternative, and all the arguments that are being put up as to why an election being the only and all the problems that I was going to constitute with how you would vote and how you would what results that would give. The only way of getting a clear result is, as I understand what Jeremy Corbyn is proposing, that he's saying, right, that Tories have failed to come up with a reasonable get-out deal for the population to vote to get out, and he will undertake to get the best deal he can for them and put it in put it back to the people as as part of a referendum, saying here's the best deal that can be got for you, and the alternative is accept this and get out, or reject it and quit and stay in. And I think that is the way forward.
Well, look, Pat, just to take on what you've said, given that the way we've looked at an election, what this might happen, that might happen, will it get us any further? There is an argument to say if you just have the second referendum or another referendum, that would be a clean split, and then we can get back to voting for political parties based on...
Yeah, but of course, the people who have been pushing for...
Let's go, Nelson.
Yeah, the people who have been pushing for a second referendum, particularly folk in the Lib Dems, the Greens and so on, and some in the Labour Party, for most of them, that's simply a way of overturning a democratic decision that was taken in the first referendum. That's the problem that I think there is. And I think also Rick was somewhat benign in his observations about the Remain majority that is there in the House of Commons. I think that the past 3 years has shown constant evidence of the way in which everything has been done, both in Parliament and outside Parliament, by Remainers to prevent it being implemented. They simply cannot accept a democratic decision where 17.4 million people
Where do you put the ERG in that equation, Nelson? Because they have been utterly intractable.
Their position is, and I think it was right that the Theresa May deal was a bad deal. For a whole lot of reasons, some of them to do with Northern Ireland, some other reasons that they would have as well, but certainly from a Northern Ireland perspective, it was a bad deal for Northern Ireland. And I think people have the right to vote according to their conscience, but the fact is that every other party was voting against it as well, so it's not a question of it all focuses on the ERG. I think quite often the focus is placed almost exclusively on the Leave dimension. It's interesting to work out what will happen on the Remain side. How will that pan out between Labour and the Liberal Democrats? How will they do? How will they fight each other? Will they fight each other? Time will tell.
It's 20-1. I just want to break in briefly to the conversation, if you don't mind all. We're getting a line from John Campbell, who we heard from earlier on the programme, breaking news regarding Wrightbus. And John is telling us that we now know that all except around 50 Wrightbus staff have been made redundant this afternoon following the company going into administration. We can do the maths. That's around 1,350 people in the Ballymena area who are taking in that news this afternoon. Back to Brexit, though, or question, will an election solve Brexit? 0, 30, 30, 80, 55, 55. We are looking at pictures coming into us from the House of Commons. Geoffrey Cox, the Attorney General, has been fielding questions for the last 40 minutes or so. In fact, probably guts of an hour at this stage.
Can I get back to that central question?
Yes.
And I was saying earlier, an election won't solve it because you're going to have a four-way split. But it won't solve it for another reason, and that is no one knows what the UK wants. And if there's an election and they go back to the EU and try to reopen the agreement, no one has agreed what they want. The EU have been asking them for 3 years, tell us what you want, and the government can't answer that question.
The Leave side is as fragmented as the Remain side.
Yes, of course they are. But if you've got a government which goes to the EU and says, right, OK, we've had an election and here's what we want, that could be a step forward. But that won't happen because nobody knows what the UK wants. They've tried so many times, and the people who have been negotiating on behalf of the government have come back to the House of Commons and have been rejected because there is not an agreement. And that's the thing about the majority in the House of Commons at the moment. The only thing they can agree on is they don't want no deal. They don't want to crash out. They can't agree on anything else.
As we've been talking, our political correspondent Stephen Walker has been keeping his ears on the House of Commons. Give us a sense of what's happening in there, Stephen.
Well, Declan, Geoffrey Cox, the Attorney-General, has been on his feet now for about an hour. He's been answering many questions from all sides, questions from the SNP and Labour and independent MPs. He's tried to end his session on a number of occasions. He's sat down thinking that it's over, and then he's had to get up again, so there's a little bit of the pantomime about it.
Is he a man under pressure?
Well, if he is under pressure, he's putting in quite a brave performance. You know, he's quite a rumbustious figure. He's obviously a barrister. He's very easy to think on his feet, but he is putting in quite a performance, and he's clearly enjoying the cut and thrust of it. In fact, he's been teasing the Labour Party, saying they should agree to an election, basically saying that eventually turkeys have to vote for Christmas. So he's called the Labour Party cowards for not backing an election. So there's been a fair bit of theatre about it this morning. He said that Parliament, in his words, was a disgrace and this was a dead Parliament. In response, lots of calls from the opposition for him to publish this Attorney-General's advice. He clearly says he's thinking about that. Also calls from the opposition to declare exactly what the cost was of all this sort of legal affair. So lots of questions coming in from the opposition. The opposition obviously enjoying the moment, feeling that the government have been humiliated and embarrassed by the Supreme Court decision. So it's a pretty lively affair. But as I say, he's tried to sit down and move on a number of occasions, but the questions just keep coming and coming.
Stephen, thanks. Felicity Huston, can Geoffrey Cox keep his job given that the advice that he gave was thrown out by the Supreme Court?
Well, I did rather like his line that if every lawyer who lost a case, had to resign, most of them wouldn't have much of a career. It is how the profession, I understand, works. They give advice. And, one never knows quite. One thinks one has a good case. I'm, as you probably know, a tax specialist, an accountant, but also a tax specialist. So I do a lot with case law with the Inland Revenue, and take cases for clients. And, I would say to them, we have a good case. This is what the law is. This is what the case law is. And I think we will win. And I'm glad to say that, touch wood, so far in 30 years, I don't think I've lost a case yet. But you can't be sure of it. That's not how...
He's the government's top lawyer.
Yes, I know, but that's why there are, that's why you have argued cases in front of judges, because it's not clear cut, is it? They have to make a decision on it. He believed he had a good case, because obviously if he didn't, he'd have told them not to go ahead. That was, I presume, his view. And no lawyer goes into court with their client saying, yeah, we're on a surefire winner here, we're going to, absolutely home in a boat. They will never say that, because it's not how it works.
Well, look, if you're one of the many solicitors and barristers listening to Talkback this afternoon, shouting at the radio and what we're saying, you can give us a ring as well. 030 30 80 55 55. John's in Belfast. Afternoon, John.
Hello, Declan. Declan, I thought I would love a general election. But you vote in a general election to vote the government that represents the people. And while this Brexit thing goes on for the last 3 years, you'd be voting for Brexit. It wouldn't be a general election. So there should be a people's vote before a general election. And that's the only way to sort it out.
A general election won't achieve anything beyond...
because they'd be voting on the Brexit issues. We need to get Brexit sorted out. The people over here don't want Brexit. The people in Scotland don't want Brexit. And we keep hearing from unionist politicians that the country voted this for 52%. They also forget in 1922, all Ireland voted, the people voted for a united Ireland in 1982 or 1922 by 82% or 89%.
Well, let's try and keep the focus on the current constitutional
I'm just
issues.
About general democracy.
I understand that.
All right.
I understand that. Thanks, John. Warren's in Balahi. Warren, can you hear me?
Hello?
How's it going?
Yep, not so bad.
General election, what's the point?
See, what's the point of it? Because it doesn't matter who the Prime Minister is. The Parliament's not going to let us leave. Parliament doesn't want to leave, so they're not going to let the country leave.
Well, that would surely change if the mathematics inside changed, wouldn't it?
What do you mean by mathematics?
Would you...
trying to take away the best bargaining chip there is, and that's leaving without a deal. Like, that'd be like me telling you I could sell a car for £1,000, but actually looking, and then you say I'll buy it for £1,000, and me telling you, no, I want 1,500. You're not going to give me 1,500, you're going to give me 1,000, because that's what I first said. You know?
Depends on the state of the car, Warren, I suppose.
It must be pretty poor if it's £1,000.
Warren, thank you. 030 30 80 55 55 from Balahi to Ballywalter. Hi, Alec.
Declan. Something that interests me, there was 21 Tory MPs lost the party whip. There's a lot more of them voted to remain or are overt remainers. What happens if a lot of the anti-Brexit MPs on both sides of the House are deselected by their local party?
That's a great question.
Would that not have a fairly big effect on the election when we have one?
Because that is one way, presumably, Boris Johnson could take on the Brexit Party by selecting different candidates to stand in those areas, Rick?
Yes. One other question, one other observation.
Right.
If we do have another referendum, the result will depend purely on what the questions are. That can be rigged to give any answer you want.
Alec,
I don't think another referendum is the answer.
Alec, I'll get Rick to respond to you in just a moment. I want to cross back to the Commons. The former Work and Pension Secretary and former Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, is on her feet.
Find that compromise and to cease this language of pitting Parliament against the people.
I assure my right honourable friend that if I hadn't been driven to this language, I would never have used it. The fact is... Oh, yes. The fact of the matter is that the opposition won't let the government govern. Yep. The opposition won't do what the opposition should do in these circumstances, which is vote for an election. By any standards, the government is in a minority. It's having the order paper taken over from it again and again, and no doubt further attempts to come. And that is the very definition of a parliament that won't fulfil its responsibilities, either to let the Queen's government to be able to be conducted or to opt for a general election. That is why I call this a dead parliament, and I do so advisedly. And I know my right honourable friend knows. Nobody worked hard.
Geoffrey Cox, the Attorney General, responding to Amber Rudd. But Alec is still on the line, I know. And Alec, I want to turn to Rick Wilford on this. The point Alec raises is that is a tool at Boris Johnson's disposal, that he could select different MPs, new Brexit-leaning MPs in those areas, and that would surely give the Brexit Party a run for its money, wouldn't it?
It's not in his gift to put up particular candidates for particular constituencies. What each of the parties does is they have a candidate list. People apply to be put on the list. But the ultimate decision about who becomes the prospective parliamentary candidate is for the local constituency party or association in the case of the Conservatives. So it's delegated down to constituency level.
How much pressure can the Prime Minister put on those local constituency groups?
They can. The central office, Conservative Central Office, which is, the party HQ, yes, will manage the lists, and they could certainly sort of stack the lists such that they would ensure that sort of dyed-in-the-wool Remainer candidates are included on the list, but it's actually for the constituency association to make that particular decision. And they may not decide, as it were, to take the steer from the centre and assert their relative autonomy at constituency level. So he can't, as it were, put placemen and women into constituencies in order to manufacture a Leave majority in the House on the Conservative benches.
Robert in Carrickfergus. Robert, do you think putting a people's vote before a general election would be putting the cart before the horse?
Yes, I do.
Tell me.
I do. I would like to make a point on this, and then I'd like to ask the panel a wee question,
Please
if you don't mind. First of all, I think that they should have the general election first. Put on their manifesto paper, their paper that they give out round the doors and that before they do, whether they're going to vote for Remain or vote to leave. And then that way, people will know what they're voting for the MPs to go in and do it, instead of all this Remainers voting against the will of the people in the first place.
I'm not sure Labour voters would be very clear on what they're doing.
Precisely. No, good luck with the Labour Party.
A lot of Labour voters actually voted, a lot of their constituents actually voted to leave. And Labour as a party are going against what their constituents in them areas voted for.
But I mean, I take your point about the manifesto, but we know from the party conference this week they have voted to remain on the fence, and that's what's going to be on the manifesto.
Yeah,
now,
that'll
be up to Labour.
If they go out in a general election, the candidate that's actually standing, let them know what they're doing. Because that's effectively who you're voting in. That candidate will have your vote in the Parliament. But the question I wanted to ask was... Sorry?
Yeah, what was you said you had a question for the panel.
Yes, the question I wanted to ask was, the Supreme Court ruled yesterday that government being suspended was unlawful because government had to represent the people of the United Kingdom. Is that correct?
No. They said Parliament being suspended was unlawful.
Yes, so because it had to represent the people. Is that not correct?
Yeah.
Well, both
represent, allowed to do its work.
Both represent the people and hold the government to account.
Yes. Well, Stormont was suspended for 3 years, is it? And under what the Supreme Court yesterday, we're a part of the United Kingdom. Should we not be represented in Parliament by ministers who represent Stormont by doing the likes of health, the education, and passing the laws over here? Should we not effectively be under direct rule? Or is it illegal for what Sinn Féin have done and suspend the government over here the same way as Boris Johnson done in the UK?
Well, you are represented by Julian Smith. At the end of the day, any assembly here is simply a twig on the branch of the Home Office. It's an emanation of the Home Office. It's devolved government.
And yesterday we saw a legal challenge to the position of government, and we've seen similar things over the Stormont issue here. People have made those attempts. Felicity, I heard you kind of breathing heavily there, almost disagreeing with the suggestion. Is that fair?
Sorry, which suggestion? Where have we got to?
Sorry, that's all right.
Sorry, there have been various.
Where were you, Felicity?
I'm sorry. Thinking about Geoffrey Cox and
were you?
How he's channeling his inner rumpole again, isn't he? You know.
He is also.
Don't think too much about him, Felicity. You know, keep it a secret.
I know these are serious times, but for a voice like Geoffrey Cox as well, the man could sell anything.
The command he has of that cockpit. I mean, he really is tremendous. You know, it's great to hear somebody like that who is a performer in what is our very
but the more he talks, the less he says.
Yes.
Tony in Belfast, welcome to Talkback, Tony.
Hiya. Most of this problem seems to be the backstop, doesn't it? Right? So,
certainly a significant one.
Yeah, right. So why not just let the people of Northern Ireland here have a referendum here to see the one-way party in Northern Ireland? And then that way, that gets rid of the whole backstop question for the English. And the English themselves have actually said in referendum polls that they would let the north of Ireland go. So let us go and have a referendum and see how it goes.
Well, the Secretary of State has to be persuaded
that
there is a demand for constitutional change. You can't sort of hold a referendum in order to cement the status quo.
Because any conversation, any discussion about the backstop brings you immediately into the discussion about the border, and
it does. Yes. Well, that's what I think the caller is actually intimating.
Yeah. The problem with that all is that the Secretary of State has to. The last Prime Minister didn't want to hold a referendum because she thought she would lose it. So that to me tells me that it is time for a referendum, because then it shows that the people who want the referendum will win it. You know, the people who want the United Ireland will win it. So therefore, the Secretary of State has no legs to stand on and say we don't have a referendum.
Thank you very much, Tony. Let's hear from Elizabeth in Helens Bay. Thanks for calling us, Elizabeth. You're not convinced by this referendum idea?
You know, I'm very confused with the whole thing.
You are not alone in that position, Elizabeth.
Yeah, 3 years this Parliament has done absolutely nothing but sit in its hands. The people have voted to leave. So those MPs are put into that Parliament by the people. So what is the problem? I mean, they have got the people's vote. No, listen, please.
Elizabeth.
The referendum said leave.
Elizabeth, I'm going to interrupt you. I promise I'll return. Lydia Herman is on her feet in the Commons.
Crossed his mind that if the Prime Minister made a ridiculous decision to prorogue Parliament for 5 weeks in the run-up to Brexit, which is the greatest constitutional change to the UK for years, that the courts would rule that to be an unlawful prorogation of Parliament.
If I were to answer that question, tempting though it is, particularly from my honourable, I was going to say my honourable friend, the honourable lady, but she's a friend as well, I would be transgressing the Law Office's convention because I would be telling her what advice I had or hadn't given. But if she asks me, did it occur to me? Well, of course it did. Of course it occurred to me. Any barrister who enters into litigation, if it doesn't occur to him that he might lose, is a bit of a nit, isn't he? I mean, really. Of course it occurred to me we might lose. But the reality is it would be ridiculous not to.
Geoffrey Cox struggling to finish a sentence, but he settled on the word nit there. Elizabeth, you were interrupted, and what you're basically saying, and it's been said before, what's the problem? The vote was the vote. But look, we are where we are, and if there's a general election coming, in order to shake things up a little bit, would you consider changing how you voted last time? In order to
I would vote again leave. But what I'm actually saying is the people have been badly mistreated, misled. Parliament has gone against the Constitution where the people are concerned. So it's not the people who are to blame. It's the MPs who are fighting among themselves. And really and truly, we need to clear out Parliament. People need to put in MPs who are going to vote for what they say. Not what they think, but what the people say.
That's certainly the theory, but as we've explored in the last hour, it may not necessarily be as simple as that. Elizabeth in Helens Bay, you got the last word on this. Thank you for giving us a ring. Also, thank you to my guests, Brian Feeney, Nelson McCausland, Felicity Huston and Rick Wilford, and all the callers to the programme. We're just approaching the news. After that, however, we'll be talking about, as the BBC prepares its annual Music Day, what song was playing when your life changed forever? A birth, a death, your first kiss, I don't mind. What song was playing when your life changed? It's 1 o'clock.
And with the BBC News, I'm Tina Campbell. Good afternoon. Almost all of Wrightbus's 1,400 staff have been made redundant after the company entered administration. The Ballymena manufacturer is best known for its London Routemaster bus, known as the Boris bus. Our business reporter Richard Morgan is outside the plant near Ballymena.
Staff and unions arrived early this morning to be briefed by managers that efforts to find an investor or buyer were not successful. As they left the factory, workers said they're angry and disappointed, including Norman Stevens, who worked at the company for 30 years.
For 5 years, top management had stood in the canteen and told us, listen lads, we can't give you a wage rise this year, we're sorry, we're investing in the company. If they were invested in the company, I wouldn't be standing here now talking to you. Who's going to employ a 62-year-old man? I mean, I've nothing now.
Wrightbus was facing cash flow problems as the bus market weakened, and it's been unable to resolve those issues. This news is a huge blow to the Northern Ireland economy and to Ballymena, which has lost major manufacturers in recent years, including JTI Gallagher's and Michelin.
Davy Thompson from the Unite Union said the government must intervene to save jobs and skills.
We have been speaking to political representatives, from local MP right through to we've made calls into the Secretary of State. We have asked for a meeting with Boris Johnson regarding this, and regarding his comments less than a month ago where he said he would do everything. Well, he can't do everything. He can step in today. Yeah. There is nothing in state aid rules which prevents a British government doing that there.
In other news, there have been fierce exchanges during the first session of Commons business since yesterday's Supreme Court ruling that the government's decision to suspend Parliament was unlawful. The government's most senior legal advisor, the Attorney General Geoffrey Cox, faced angry criticism from MPs about the move. He said his legal advice had been sound. He told the Commons that this Parliament was dead and should no longer sit.
Twice they have been asked to let the electorate decide upon whether they should continue to sit in their seats while they block 17.4 million people's votes. This Parliament is a disgrace.
The PSNI says it's looking into admissions made to the BBC Spotlight series on the Troubles by a man who said he was 100% connected to a major IRA bombing campaign. The comments were made by Patrick Ryan, a former priest from Tipperary. Speaking at a cross-border crime conference in Cavan, the Irish Justice Minister said any extradition request would be considered. Here's our South West reporter, Julian Fowler.
Patrick Ryan was arrested with bomb-making materials in Belgium in 1988, but Ireland refused to extradite him to the UK. After watching last night's Spotlight on the Troubles programme, the Irish Justice Minister Charlie Flanagan said any new extradition request would be considered by the authorities.
I won't comment on any individual case, but what I will say is that no application has been made for the extradition of anybody. In the event of such application being made, it will be a matter entirely for the courts and not for me as Minister for Justice.
A PSNI Assistant Chief Constable is examining last night's programme to see what additional evidence it may contain.
A woman's died after being attacked by 2 dogs at her home in Cheshire. Fiona Trott has the details.
Officers are still at the house on Graham Road in Widnes where the attack happened late yesterday afternoon. Cheshire Police say when paramedics arrived, the 44-year-old woman was in a serious condition. They treated her injuries, but she died at the scene. Police say 1 dog has been destroyed. The other is in a secure kennel. A neighbour believes the victim was the mother of 3 children. The breed of the 2 dogs has not been confirmed by the police, but they believe they were known to the woman and were living at the address.
Climate change is causing sea levels to rise faster than previously predicted, according to a major report. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says the process is speeding up as Greenland and